Greetings, comrades. You're listening to a very special episode of the Truth Tank. The lie has arrived, but the truth will be told. The Lie of Communism has finally arrived. This episode is a prologue to the Lie of Communism. It's a quick intro episode to what you can expect from the Lie of Communism. This has been 3 years in the making. It is finally here. I have finally recorded the prologue and chapter 1. It is going to be a truly epic journey. I've spent many hundreds of hours writing and researching this show, as well as a lot of blood, sweat and tears. So, greetings comrades, this has been a long time coming. The prologue in chapter 1 was supposed to be recorded and out by the end of March of 2025, but unfortunately my computer decided to shit itself, which you can hear all about on previous episodes, I won't go into that again, which chucked a very large spanner in the works and has delayed me for a couple of months. But the good news is the wait is finally over. The Lie of Communism is finally here. It's also allowed me to do a lot more reading and research for the show. I recently brought Leon Trotsky's biography, which has come in very handy at understanding someone who was actually there and lived this time rather than reading about it via a historian's perspective 30, 50 or 100 years after the fact. That will be used a lot in this show to provide a lot more historical context and a different perspective from the man that was actually there on the ground and had a massive impact on shaping communism and the Communist Party. So what can you expect from the Lie of Communism? Well, you can expect a very long, dark and detailed dive into the truly fascinating and disturbing history of communism in Russia. I won't be going into the origins of communism, that's going to be touched on a little bit. This is going to focus specifically on how communism came to be in Russia, how it spread, and ultimately how it transformed the country. For better or worse, I'll leave that up to you to decide. I am the narrator, I am not forcing my opinion on anybody else. I encourage you to listen and think about what happened during the early 1900s, come to your own conclusions, make up your own mind, because it is a very fascinating story and it's one that can potentially happen again, especially given the current state of the world and the direction that it's heading. At this stage, I'm not sure how many parts there will be to the Lie of Communism. It's probably going to be a lot. I spent 3 years writing a 421-page script for this show. I got a little bit obsessed. If I was to release it all in one gigantic series, it'd probably take me the rest of the year, maybe a year and a half to record and edit and then release it, which means there would be no Truth Tank episodes throughout the year. So at this stage, I'll be releasing Lie of Communism episodes in between the other Truth Tank episodes and the Weekly Tank. Some of them will be movie reviews, some of them will be historical-based shows, current events, things like that. The episodes will be clearly labelled as Lie of Communism Chapter 1. They won't be called parts. I'm going to set this out like a book. It's going to be all in chapters. This will be Prologue Chapter 1, Chapter 2, etc. So you'll know exactly what part of the story we're up to. Will it be worth the wait? In my humble opinion, yes it fucking will be. I've spent a lot of time and effort researching, writing and recording this show, so I hope everybody gets something out of it and appreciates the hours and years of my time that have gone into this. If at the very least you get something out of it, or you start to think about history a little different, or you get interested in these characters, then I have done my job. How I've tried to tell this tale and what I have tried to do with the Lie of Communism is tell the story of communism in Russia through the two main leaders of the Communist Party, Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. One of these two communist leaders' stories I really felt needed to be told in its full and detailed form. In my opinion, I think history may have gotten its judgment about him wrong or a little skewed, but that's up to you to make up your own mind and to form your own opinion. This is purely my own opinion of this individual. I'm not going to tell you who it is. You're going to have to listen and find out. But I do think history may have been a bit too harsh on him. One of the characters I think history has judged adequately. They've got most of his story right. He's a bit more cut and dry. But the other one, I think, might be a victim of history and not the time that he was actually living in. Because I do think he is a genius in certain regards. He had a very advanced mind and could see the future and predict pretty accurately what was going to happen in society. But you're just going to have to listen to find out who that is and get all the details. I started researching the Lie of Communism on the 7th of March 2022. This is really where the journey started, you could say. I didn't think it would take up so much time or take so long to write and research. There were many times I wanted to scrap it and move on to something else because it felt too big to ever complete. The story kept going. I kept going down rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole, finding a little connection here, another rabbit hole over here, another historical event that ties into everything, another historical figure whose story I felt needed to be told. And that's another thing I didn't mention. There are a lot of characters in this, some of which have a little slice of history, and I really wanted to tell their stories because they're an integral part of the story of communism and the Russian Revolution and everything that happened in that time period. And I think their stories are just as important as Vladimir Lenin's and Leon Trotsky's and some of the major characters in the story of communism. And I wanted to take the time to tell their stories properly and to really research who these people were, the time they were living in, what their reality was, and how they viewed the world. A key part of the history of communism that I think has really been overlooked is some of the heroic characters and heroic deeds that were carried out during the revolution and the turbulent years afterwards. And some of the more well-known victims like the Romanovs and the Tsar. Everyone, well, not everybody, but if you're into history, especially 20th century history, you would have heard of the story of Tsar Nicholas and the fall of the Romanov family. It's a dark stain on history, and it's one that could have been avoided, but that's a fair way off in this tale. But as with everything, there are good guys and bad guys on both sides, and there's morally virtuous people and evil people on both sides as well, and the smaller historical characters that are spread out in the middle of this. And this story has a lot of characters. And as I just mentioned before, I've really tried to tell some of these, not so much forgotten stories, but overlooked historical stories. I've tried to tell them properly with the duty of care I think they deserved. And some of these characters are going to have a very profound impact on the story, and we're going to go on a very emotional and personal journey with them. And that's one of the things that really kept me going with the Lie of Communism, is trying to tell this epic, giant story properly and not just do a 3-part episode on communism and give you the cliff notes you can find on Wikipedia or any other online or physical encyclopedia or history book you can get your hands on. I really wanted to go deep and granular on this, hence why it took me 3 years to get it finished. There was a lot of rabbit holes, a lot of information, and a lot of characters to sort through. There's one minor character in this story that will leave a lasting impact, and I'm not going to give you any clue who that might be. You're just going to have to listen. As hard and as painful, tedious and long as the Lie of Communism was to research and write, something kept telling me to keep going, to get it finished and to tell the story right. Which is one of the reasons why this is probably going to be a 50-part episode on one topic. That, and I'm a little obsessed with details, if you haven't noticed by now. I get a little bit obsessive with how things connect and the details of a story, and how does this thing tie into that thing and that rabbit hole and this rabbit hole. I like to be thorough. But after a few months of writing and research and a few attempts at calling it quits on and moving on to something easier, something kept telling me, you've committed this much time and effort already. It needs to be done right, and the story needs to be told in its entirety. No matter how dark, deranged, dystopian, disturbing, dreaded and dark the story of communism is, it's still a fascinating one. You can find a lot of information about it on many other podcasts and books and YouTube channels and documentaries, but I'm not saying what they have done is better or worse, because God knows I use a lot of those resources in doing my research, and they were very helpful. But they have a snapshot or a focus on a certain part of the story or on a certain event, like just purely the revolution. which is very interesting on its own, and you could write a 700-page book just on the Russian Revolution, the fall of the Tsar, and the rise of the communists. Then you could write another 900-page book just on the rise of the Soviets and all of that Soviet history. But me having the obsession for detail wanted to tell all of these aspects, all these different stories and tales that make up this gigantic epic story of communism in one podcast series. Another reason why it took me 3 years to write and research. But going back right to the beginning of this project, the Lie of Communism was meant to be something different to ultimately what it turned out to be. It turned out very differently than what I had expected. My original idea was to do 2 versions of this story, and that's how I started writing the start of it. If the start is a little different to the rest of it in tone, that's the reason why. Ultimately, I had already put that much time and effort into doing it, and I'm not getting paid for this. The original title for the show was going to be called Communism, 2 Versions of the Same Truth, and that truth referred to the communist version of history, what they believe to be true, which lines up with their narrative and not so much reality. The other version is retrospective history, which we know to be true today, about all the horrific things that got covered up and done during the rise of the communists and later the Soviets. All those dirty secrets they try to keep hidden all got exposed many decades after they happened. The original plan was to first tell the communist version of history, their truth, because a lot of their version of history doesn't line up with what we know now. A lot of the facts are different. They manipulated certain things, they left some things out, and they made it out to be more glamorous and glorious than it actually was. One example would be the train car story, which we'll come to in a later episode. Then I'll tell the same story again, but through the historical perspective lens, which would have pointed out all the lies and bullshit. And that was going to be the very simplistic take on the Lie of Communism. In the very early days of research, I watched this really interesting documentary which was pretty much along the same lines. It told the communist story, but all the lies they told to glorify and pump up their own communist brand in order to spread it to the people, and all the other revolutions that they pretty much piggybacked and took over and inserted their own ideology. And that was a big inspiration. I can't remember what it was called because I could only find it once and I couldn't find any of the details on it, and I've looked over the years to try and find it again. I did find it late last year, but I'd already changed the show so dramatically it wasn't as useful as it was in the early stages. So that documentary pointed out some of the outlandish lies the Communist Party told, as well as some of the smaller lies that added up to this massive manipulation of their own history. Some of the things were really small, like doctoring photos. Everyone thinks Photoshop was a modern thing, but people have been doctoring photos since there's been photographs, and the communists were no different. And other more dramatic examples were covering up death tolls and some of the truly horrific things they did and tried to cover up in order to progress this lie further. So that very early idea was more or less 2 versions of the same story. That got scrapped after a few months of research when I realised this was a much bigger story than just the Communist Revolution, and I started looking into the leaders of the Communist Party, such as Lenin and Trotsky, and some of the other figures. It became a very deeper and more detailed story than just basic lies told through the Communist Party about their own history. So the start of the show will probably be a little different in tone to the rest of it, because I did keep a lot of the intro stuff because I'd worked too hard on it and I'm not getting paid for this. But it sounded good. I did like it. It does fit. It just might be a little different in tone because it does start off more towards 2 versions of the same story narrative I was going on, and then it changed to something completely different. So the more I got into the research, the more I kept thinking about this lie. What is this lie of communism? More and more rabbit holes started to open, and I started going deeper into these rabbit holes, started to get more philosophical about it, started thinking about the question more and more. Was it a simple case of the nature of the lie and the lies told by the Communist Party regarding physical evidence that they had covered up regarding members of their own party, their whereabouts during historical events, to make these guys sound more heroic and virtuous than they actually were? doctoring photos and exaggerating certain details to make and build essentially a better story and more credibility for themselves. But the more I kept thinking about that, the more philosophical this quote-unquote lie became. And the deeper I started to think about the question, what is the nature of a lie? How deep do they go? How can people be deceived by something they know to be untrue? And how and why do they continue to keep digging the hole deeper and deeper, even though they know the foundation of everything they believe in is built on bullshit? And as it originally started, there are two versions of the truth. Firstly, the Lie of Communism will look at, in detail, the key figures and events that sparked the Russian Revolution and the transition of monarchy to the Communist Party. I'll be telling the story through the key figures who were there, such as Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, and the shadow-lurking monster in the dark, Joseph Stalin. This series will focus more on the first two. Stalin is more of a Phantom Menace-like character that lurks in the shadows, who ultimately wants absolute power. The Lie of Communism won't go into a full bio on him because you could do a 30-part podcast series just on Joseph Stalin. He's a very interesting and disturbing character. The Communists aren't the only party in history to peddle this type of rhetoric either. Over the centuries, the lie has manifested and appeared time and time again. Communism, the Nazi Party, fascism, right-wing, left-wing extremists. Look at any period of time and I guarantee you will see the lie manifesting in the darkness somewhere, just waiting to suck in another generation of people. And I really try to get deep and philosophical with this idea, and obviously reading Jordan Peterson helped. I wanted to really know what was the nature of the lie. How do people get sucked into these belief systems? Is it because it's opposition to whatever they're believing in, whatever the big boogeyman happens to be? In the Lie of Communism, that happened to be Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. He was the boogeyman the communists targeted. But was he as bad as the communists made him out to be? We all know in our own personal lives where lies lead. We've all known that pathological liar, that untrustworthy piece of shit that just lies and lies and lies. Every time they open their mouth, it's some version of a fucking lie they've told themselves. It's like we're almost genetically programmed to see the red flags when people lie. There are tells, some people more so than others. But yet we still fall for it, or believe it, or pretend it's not what that person is saying. You might be wearing a blue t-shirt and they might be telling you it's pink, and you just go with it just to shut down the conversation, get them out of your life as quickly as possible. But that lie keeps perpetuating, and that's a little example. In communism, it was a much bigger and darker lie. The Tsar was the boogeyman. He needed to be brought down in order for the workers to have a better, more prosperous place to work and live. Ultimately, that wasn't the case. That led to the rise of communism and the rise of the Soviet Union. And anyone who knows the history knows how that story ended. The Nazis are the same thing. Society was in a bad way in Germany after World War I. A lot of diplomats got blamed for Germany losing the war. It's a very multi-sided problem. There was no single answer. No one was really to blame. Germany did a lot of bad shit. They deceived and lied on a very grand scale, which you can hear about in Bioweapons Part 4 and 5. Public opinion went against the historical narrative that Germany found itself in after World War I. All of a sudden, some young upstart called Adolf Hitler, a victim of World War I, spreads this political movement, starts preaching this better, fairer society. Then before you know it, the Nazi Party's on the rise, World War II starts, and millions of people die. Ultra service a lie that I think a lot of people who joined probably knew was complete bullshit, but they went along with it because they got something out of it, or it was the easiest and simplest opposition to the thing that they were pissed off at, and that being the German imperial government at the time. I could probably go on for another hour about philosophical ramblings about lies and the nature of lies and why they get you. But we've all been victims of lies in our own lives, whether this be through people we know, or you've told a lie and you've got in trouble for it, and maybe you've lost a job, you've lied to a cop, and the consequences are never very nice. And the consequences of communism in this case were unimaginable. In the earlier stages of the research and writing, I tried to blend the two versions of this story together, which didn't really work. It was going to be very messy. It was all over the place. I'd have to tell one story, then I had to go back and write the same story essentially from a different perspective. It got messy, it got boring, a lot of things got repeated, and it just didn't work. And as I mentioned before, I have recycled some of those sections into the Lie of Communism. So some parts might start or end with a different tone, but I've tried to take the best parts of two versions of the same truth and incorporate them into the bigger story I wrote probably about a year after writing the first version of the Lie of Communism. Some of the second version does make its way into the Lie of Communism. Some events and characters have been taken out and aren't focused on too much in the Lie of Communism and will come up again and play a bigger part in another supplemental part of the Lie of Communism I wrote called The Lie Continues, which takes place at the end of the Lie of Communism, but will go back over some key historical events and characters that are mentioned in the Lie of Communism, but it was just too big to try to go down that rabbit hole. So The Lie Continues are some of the outtakes of the Lie of Communism that I've put together to basically round out the story of communism, specifically the transition from the monarchy to the Communist Party and some of the truly horrific things that happened. So originally this was going to be called two versions of the same story, told from the communist point of view, and the second part was going to be told from the historical standpoint after all the communist dark secrets were revealed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which includes the thousands of books written, historians, documentaries, and eyewitness evidence that came to light after that time. So a few months into writing and research, it became apparent there was more to the story I didn't know, and it was a far darker and profoundly more disturbing psychological factor involved that I didn't anticipate when I first started the research. And as I mentioned about going down rabbit holes, I had to satisfy my own curiosity, and I had to really understand and get into the details of the origins of the Communist Party and the transition and rise of the Soviet Union after, and how all that got started and remained so dominant for so long, and how that tied back into the Communist Party and the Bolsheviks and these characters and events. What's the difference between the two? What is a Bolshevik? What is a Menshevik? Who were the men behind such radical ideas? How it caught on, and most importantly, why it caught on? Why did it come about at this specific time in history? Why did these men think like this? What led them to their own personal philosophies and outlook on society? Why did they feel the need to act? Why did they go to all the trouble in the end? And one of the more disturbing questions is, why did so many people have to die in order to achieve this ideal, this goal? Why were so many lives sacrificed for it? Why? Why was it so important? I knew what the Soviet Union was and the communists. I had a basic knowledge of what communism and the Communist Party were all about and the Soviet Union, but I didn't know the origins of how it got started. I did know who Lenin was, and I had heard of Trotsky, but not in any detail. And me being detail obsessed, I had to know how all of this started, how it all tied together, and how it ended. And as I mentioned about inspirations for this project, I've just remembered the name of the SBS documentary I watched all those years ago that really got me thinking about The Lie. It was hosted by Lucy Worsley, however you pronounce her name. This series was called Royal Myths and Secrets, The Romanovs and the Russian Revolution, Episode 6, Russian Revolution. If you come across it, definitely give it a watch. It made me look at the history of the Communist Party in a completely different light. Really did spark this personal interest in wanting to know more about the history of Russia, especially the revolution, the Civil War, Lenin and Trotsky, and how communism came to be. I also wanted to know just what is communism, what is the difference between communism and socialism. All these years later, I'm not sure I fully understand it, but I tried my best. Another inspiration on the psychological nature of the lie was from Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules of Life. I read that a few years ago, around the same time he came here, and I went to his speaking tour. That was back in 2022, 2021, something like that. I can't remember what. I was reading the book at the same time. There was a section in the book where he's talking about Russia under Stalin's rule. And if you've read any of his work, he always talks about communism and the Soviet Union. I hadn't linked those two things together when I started doing the research and the writing. And in this part of the book, he was talking about Russia under Stalin's rule. The secret police, the gulags, and how beliefs that are built upon a lie always tend to go and end up the same way, which is towards totalitarianism. And the people who implement these systems usually end up going so far into the lie they have no choice but to keep it up and continue going in the direction that they were headed, which never tends to be a positive one. The reason for this, he explains, was because if they admit that the system is wrong, it is more or less admitting defeat and acknowledging that the belief that they were manipulated by and believed in for all these years was, by definition, a lie itself. In this case, it is the reason communism came to be and the people behind it, and the monarchy, which had ignored the people for far too long. It's a bit more complex than that. You'll just have to listen to the story to get the whole complex and dramatic picture. The final reason that really inspired me to do this and to keep going was you, the listener. I wanted to do something different and tell this story that wasn't just straight boring facts or the same story that's been told over and over and over again. I wanted to put you and myself in a time machine and really look at and examine and dissect these characters and events in this period of time. I wanted to present it in a cinematic way so it's more enjoyable, easier to listen to and digest. It's bold, it's educational, it's theatrical, but most importantly of all, I hope it's going to be memorable. There are some truly unique characters and events in this story. I hope you're going to love it, because this story is going to be truly epic. So without further delay or interruption, I present to you the labour of love that I have poured my blood, sweat and tears into, the Lie of Communism. And that concludes the prologue to the Lie of Communism. I hope you all enjoyed it. It was a brief introduction episode. It explains my motivations for writing and producing this project and what you can expect from the series in general. Over the span of the next 50, 100, 200 episodes, however long it ends up being, I hope you enjoyed it and you come back for Chapter 1 of the Lie of Communism. A big thank you to everyone who listened to the end. If you'd like to support Truth Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. Head on over to the Facebook and Instagram page, give them a follow and a like. You can download and listen to your favourite episodes on Apple, Spotify, Podbean, Audible, Amazon Music, Castbox, YouTube, iHeartRadio, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell anyone you think might like the show, help spread it around and get the Truth Tank out there. If you're enjoying the show and you want to see it rise through the ranks, why not give it a 5-star rating and review? Every review helps and helps get the show noticed and will be much appreciated by yours truly. Truth Tank merch store should be up pretty soon. There's going to be some special limited edition Lie of Communism t-shirts available. Get them before they sell out. It's going to be my own take on some communist imagery. I hope you enjoy it and grab yourself one because they won't be around forever. And I'll be back in the next week or two with a brand new episode. It might be a weekly tank episode. It might be a smaller episode. Chapter 1 of the Lie of Communism has been recorded and edited by the time you're hearing this. So that should be available either after the prologue or in the next coming week or so. But until next time, I'm a tank. This is the truth. The lie has begun, but the truth will be told.